for instance, SAML profiles and LDAP mappings, and those things haven't really gotten traction. Nobody stepped up to write them. And so we've said on a couple of occasions that if somebody doesn't come up with a draft, we're going to ask to cut them from our charter, and we're actually asking Barry to allow us to cut them from our charter at this point. And that leaves us with having a discussion about the future of the working group, which we're going to do today, right? And we're going to do that by talking about some possible next steps for either this or some follow-on working group. Doesn't have to be all in one go. So we'll do some presentations from Phil and Mortessa and Björn, and then we have some time left at the end of the session to talk about what we want to do next. So, should we get going? I don't know, Phil. Right, that's a good point. If somebody has anything they want to add to the agenda, I think we already have that, right? But if not, then we can jump into talking about a proposed notify extension for Scim. Yeah, go stand in the box.
There's a camera now. So yeah, we've been talking about something like this for a while. I guess next slide. Almost since we started with Scim. Let's go to the introduction. And I was actually sort of rereading the use case document, and right there in the use case document is this concept called triggers. Because we've been talking about spontaneous state changes and wanting to know about the state changes before deciding what to do. So in our current mandate, this really talks about triggers evolve into actions that are taken, which becomes the Scim protocol. So really what we want to do here then is provide that trigger, formalize that trigger mechanism, which can be used to feed data back to a provisioning system, which then decides what it wants to do, and it may in turn do more Scim operations somewhere else in response to that. So that's where we're coming from. Next slide. So two extreme cases on the spectrum. On one end, to let domains coordinate with each other when changes have occurred. Another one, though, could be a very simple subscription against one resource so that a mobile app can know that the user's profile has changed for some reason, and that it should go get the information, or we'll just pass the app the information. So there can be a feed that describes one individual, or it's going to one place. And you can have feeds that might represent your entire repository, and you could have thousands of updates per second. So that's sort of the extreme thing, and there are probably many use cases in between. A lot of it comes from our customers who want to coordinate things that are happening in their enterprise domain and things that are happening independently in the cloud, and they may want to set up rules. If this changes in the cloud, we're going to do something on our side to coordinate. What that is really depends on what the business scenario is. So it's not just a simple, because their name changed or their role changed here, that doesn't necessarily mean the receiving domain thinks that that's interesting or not. It just wants to know. Next slide. So the general architecture is one where we define a notification hub which receives events from the Scim service provider. That can be actually the same server, but the idea is to be able to offload the work of delivering those messages and figuring out which subscribers need to be notified once an event has occurred. So originally that broad architecture we broadly took from a spec called PubSub HubHub, and that's what we took from that was the idea that sometimes you want to offload this activity because you want your Scim service provider to keep up with the changes that it's processing. And we don't want to maintain a historical history like we did with LDAP and have a changelog kind of thing where clients are constantly pinging the changelog. Has anything changed? Has anything changed? We'd rather have event messages just be delivered for those that are interested and have a service take care of that. One of the things, we talked about this in Hawaii, and we said, well, doesn't web push do this? And it does, but it's really the delivery mechanism. And what we're talking about is sort of the information plan related to Scim as to how I define a feed, what are the messages, and so forth. And then to us, web push is just one possible way to deliver it. Another two possibilities, sort of in a RESTful model, is I call it callback, where the hub does an HTTP post to a subscriber. Or if I've got to go across a firewall, an enterprise might do an HTTP GET to pick up events on some frequency. That GET means then the notification hub has to be concerned with how many events can it store over a period of time. So if you have a high rate of change, thousands of ops per second, that can queue up fairly quickly. So it's something, some flexibility is warranted. There's also mobile phones, where we've got Apple push notification, Google message service, and Window message service. I'm not sure what the name is now, but so it occurs to me that we would need some kind of registry and an interface point that says this is how you describe a web push and how it works with OAuth, or works with the notification system. We're dealing with registries in OAuth this week, so wrong standard. Okay, next slide. So typical Scim, on the left, a state change or a trigger occurs, and the provisioning system says, oh, okay, I need to update my local repository, and I need to update the other domain, and so forth. That's the normal Scim flow. Next slide. The interesting case now is if I had an enterprise system on the left and say Oracle Cloud or Google Cloud on the right or whatever it is, state change occurs independently in the cloud. What we want to do is set up some process whereby the enterprise can be notified that something's changed. Now that could include the actual data that's changed, or it might be just John Bradley's record has changed. You figure out what you want to do. So eventually the event message gets sent back to the provisioning controller. It interprets that and then decides what it needs to do with that event, which means maybe updating its local repository. Next slide. So this is where it gets interesting. In addition to just sort of mimicking a create has occurred, a delete has occurred, and so forth, we also have to consider there's add and remove. I could have an existing user which has been added to a feed. So if a feed's based on some selection criteria, the user's either been manually added to the feed or the user, something's changed about the user, and we just simply need to know, hey, this resource is now part of your feed. Then we have the create. Another high-level one that seems to come up, and this will also sort of come up a bit in Mortez's presentation on soft delete, the idea of activate and deactivate. I think there's a relationship between, if instead of doing a delete, you might do a deactivate. And a deactivate really is a business concept that says this is what we mean by deactive, like it's status inactive. But there seems to be, that's an important event to track independently of this specific data has changed. Modified delete, password change. I have that in there to say as a talking point. I'm not sure if it stays long term. It might require special handling. There are requests to notify and to do it for password syncing, which I do not like as a deliverable, but it's there so we can talk about it. And then I have a confirmation type, which is a special type that notify needs when you're trying to set up a connection with a subscriber. You just want to confirm can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Have I got the right endpoint? So that's more of an administrative detail. So that's just the way it is now. If you look at the current draft we've published, that's what's there now. Next slide. So the message is basically a JSON message, and it follows the Scim style of formulating a message in that, first of all, it has schemas. You have a publisher URI, where the Scim service provider thinks what feeds this is relevant for. And so then the notification hub can say, well, it's relevant to these 2 feeds. I'll start delivering that and figuring out who the subscribers are. The resource URIs is what's the resource that was affected, and then what was the operation. There was a create, and the ID, name, username, password, and emails was modified or set. The Scim server generates this and gives it to the hub and then forgets about it. So to the Scim server, this is almost like a logging function. That's something to figure out, and it depends on how you model your feeds. So we'll have to talk about that. There in the document, there are 5 models for defining a feed. So you can have a static feed that's more like a group. You just put objects in it. You could have a dynamic feed. The question I have about that is what's the cost to the server, but calculating all your dynamic feeds every time. So I came up with 5 different models for feeds, and I think that's one thing we have to talk through as a group. In this one shows you that we could put raw data, and in the spec I've said if you feel you must send raw data, then it should be encrypted. So the way we actually send this is to encode it into a JWT. So in this case, we would actually encrypt it as well. So I've put stuff around signing and encrypting to secure the message. So the idea is now I can have a message, it gets delivered to multiple subscribers. The hub is really the trusted entity because it has to encrypt the message for each entity to make sure that the correct subscriber got it. So we've had to work through what are some of those issues and what would that look at. So we have all this Jose technology we can use, so I'm proposing we just do that. And that gives us then the ability to push these messages out over APNS if that's what we want to do. And we don't have to worry about is that secure, because the message should be secure by itself. It's my assertion, though, that a lot of times you don't need to send the raw data. It's enough for many of the provisioning systems to simply know the state has changed, this resource has been modified, and then the provisioning system does a get, if it thinks it's important, does a get and said, tell me about the current state, now I'll decide what I need to do to reconcile. If you're curious, there is, from the Hawaii presentation, some material about how just because a modify occurs in one domain doesn't mean it's the same modify in the other. So I went through some theory on that. I talk about it a little bit in the draft, but for example, a delete in one domain is not necessarily a delete in the other. Take, for example, say it's Salesforce, and my CRM role has disappeared, so it's a delete in Salesforce. It's not a delete in my home domain. So that's what I mean by reconciliation and why eventing is useful. Next slide. So the next slide is there's a JWT encoded message. It's not really useful here, but the point is that's what the spec is calling for, and that's the container. Next slide. I think that's it. So I didn't want to spend too much time because we didn't have that much time, but if anybody's read the spec, I can answer questions. I think the ultimate goal, though, is to decide, do we want this on the charter going forward?
Right. So I propose that we take all of the sort of chartering discussions and what to do with the extension proposal at the end of the all of the presentations, because I think we need to sort of see this as the whole board before we can talk about it. So I don't think you have to stand in the box unless there are people who want to ask questions.
Did you specify in the specification whether...
Hang on. Go to the mic. Yeah, it's just because of the screaming. It's not.
There's some remote people.
Paul Warbeler. So did you specify in the specification how you subscribe to subsets of changes? Say there's multiple tenants, and how do you specify who has access to subscribe to what?
That's talked about in the spec, although I don't think it's fully addressed yet. It's a starting point. And we have to go back to what's the model for a feed? How do you define the feed? One of the reasons why I think it's not a great thing to pass data is that your access control model becomes dramatically simple. If I just say John Bradley's record has changed, I don't have to get into a lot of processing about which fields can I tell you about and all of that kind of stuff, so it makes it faster. If I do decide to send you data, then I should have to check an access model to see whether you can be told about that.
But you need to know that this entity that's listening has access to that user, right? Or
that's right.
Probably
that's
guess
right.
that they have
yeah.
some access to it.
So there's two levels to it. Can this entity know about this resource, and then can it know about what events? And once that's fixed, then the question is, can I tell them about specific values, which is a more detailed policy question. So I want the notification to be lightweight, and a better design then is often for like if we're talking about the enterprise scenario, the enterprise provisioning system then gets that request and says, oh, I need to know about Phil Hunt's resource. And when it does the normal get, then the normal Scim access control kicks in to actually say, well, this is what you can be told about.
I think that piece would be important for some of the use cases.
Definitely. Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Who's up next? Oh, so Morteza is going to take off his hat and talk about soft deletes. Yeah, just tell me.
Morteza. So this came up years ago. I actually took the AI back in when we were doing Scim 1.0. That's okay.
Doing later.
The soft delete came up as one of the requirements that we wanted to deal with, and we never really, even though it sort of was high on everybody that implemented it, or at least a bunch of folks that implemented it, we never really got to write it down. I know various implementation have addressed this in different ways, and the discussion was about whether we want to sort of standardize it or not. There are really sort of two big drivers for this. One of them is essentially referential integrity. We use sort of the ID notion for the references for obvious reason, and then once you have the record gets deleted, then how do you say when Morteza uploaded a file into Box and Morteza is deleted because he's no longer an employee of this company, I still want to see Morteza's name on as the person that uploaded. Sort of the ownership and sort of, a lot of other things might be transferred to somebody else or administrator or something, but you still want to see, or the comments, or a lot of sort of historical data, or WebEx sort of, recordings, or somebody that sort of, scheduled a WebEx meeting or whatever. So there's a lot of that referential integrity that becomes really important. And then the second part of it is restoration. We actually sort of, in our implementation, we hit this with our very first deployment, which was actually our own IT department. Somebody accidentally went and wiped out a whole bunch of record out of Active Directory, and we had a connector that was sort of sending stuff to the cloud. And then they said, oops, and then they went and sort of, created a new connector, and then started creating a whole bunch of new thousands and thousands of new users, and they ended up becoming brand new users which are not connected to any of existing objects. So everybody got new ID, and oh wow, sort of, you had all these, like we ended up going and manually fixing this. So we went back and solved this problem specifically for our connector, but again, sort of a standard solution for this is pretty important, because that really happens in real world, and our customers are hitting this all the time now. Next. The basic concept is really about, we want sort of all the clients that do, really this is modeled after what we did with sort of a lot of the LDAP extension, a lot of sort of LDAP control extended controls that we had in the LDAP world. We want all the clients that don't know anything about Scim to sort of, continue to operate as Scim, core Scim specifies. It's just that the semantics of that object is really different. So a client that doesn't know anything about soft delete can still do a query and see all the objects that are not deleted, not soft deleted, but doesn't have any ability to see soft deleted objects unless it's aware of the extension. Similarly, if I do a delete, I just want to see that record gone. So if I do a delete followed by a read, I should not see that if I'm not requesting for the soft deleted options. But, and as a result of that, I should be able to sort of do the classic, I create Morteza, I delete Morteza, and then I create Morteza again. I shouldn't see a conflict. I should be able to sort of, create Morteza the second time, and it would get a new record for me unless I'm aware of the soft delete semantics. So that's the basic sort of semantic that we wanted to keep, because a lot of clients don't care. It's not applicable to them. It's really around the administrative aspects of it that we want to sort of do this, as opposed to every single client that talks Scim. So that was the first one. I actually think I covered the other one too. Next. So the basic model is you have a normal state of an object. If you do a delete operations on it, it goes into a soft deleted. That record still exists, but it does not sort of play into regular operations of Scim, non sort of, soft deleted operations. And it does not affect your uniqueness criteria or any other sort of semantics like that. You can go from that state with doing an on-delete and bring it restating the object into a regular state, or you can do a hard delete, and potentially you could do the hard delete operations as a cleanup or sort of, batch processing. So if we have a WebEx user that doesn't sort of, deleted their record and they sort of haven't logged in for 6 months, we can just go and behind the scene delete it. But you can certainly do a hard delete operations for a set of objects that you really want to get rid of it for whatever reason, privacy reasons or whatever other reasons that you might have. And then once it's hard deleted, it's gone. It's no longer, it's in the system. Or it could be up to the sort of the vendor or the implementer that it actually keeps a shadow copy for archival reasons or whatnot. But from Scim semantics, it's completely gone. There's no way of bringing it back. Next. Uniqueness is obviously the key part of this, because again, one is the first semantic that we really want to be able to sort of recreate objects, and a really important part of it is the fact that you may end up with conflict when you sort of try to undelete an object because of the fact that you allow the operations to sort of the regular operations to take over that namespace. You might have to deal with sort of conflict resolution on the way back when you undelete the object. And then the second part of it, which really adds a lot of complexity, is and a lot of thinking needs to be added to that. The draft doesn't really cover this in detail. It just kind of puts a few question marks really, is how do you do things with references? How do you do things with group membership when you go and delete a user? Do you want to go update that? Do you want to sort of, you don't necessarily want to go, as soon as you undelete a user that was deleted, go and add them to the group because the administrator might have actually wanted to remove them during that process. There's a lot of questions around what you want to do with references, and we did actually an implementation of something similar to this, and what we chose was all the references are gone. We took the easy route. When you undelete an object, you really, basically you have to come back and recreate all the references. That was sort of the easy way out. Potentially this is what we want to do. I don't know if that's open to discussion. I think Active Directory does very similar model. They basically get rid of majority of not only all the references, but a lot of other attributes they actually delete. And then sort of undelete, you have to resupply them. In our implementation, sort of in our experiment, I wouldn't call that implementation. It was more of an experiment. We basically just get rid of the references. Next. So the basically same question as Phil. Is this something that I know there are a few vendors that are interested in this, but the question is this something that we want to sort of take it on as a broader set of work that we want to do? And then obviously the second question is this something that would be interesting to the Scim as a charter change or sort of individual submission type of work? Tony.
Yes, Tony Nadlin. I think this delete, I think you have a use case for, we have a use case for create. And so I'm just wondering if it shouldn't be just narrowed down to active or not active or something else, instead of specifying this as a specific delete, we could have a state that, does the same characteristics that you said for delete, which would in fact be for create also, and other states and other things that people want to do. So,
Yeah,
yes, exactly. Yep, exactly the case that we have for Active Directory and that our customers want.
so I'm not only open, I'm very interested in actually talking to you and getting a little bit more sort of understanding of the use cases. In our implementation, when we went through this process, we handled all the create, because we had this similar sort of, create, but it's not really done, whether it's not validated by the administrator or by the end user itself. So like the classic, I send you an email until you click on that link, I don't actually add you to the system. The semantic of that was slightly different, and we handled that differently, but I totally agree that that is a problem as well, whether that's part of this, or it's a separate draft, or we generalize it and do it for all operations. I'm totally open. This is just, I just threw out the idea, and it's totally open to taking it where we think is the right sort of path.
Bjorn, Onestad. I'm tending to agree with Tony because in a hyper-connected world where lots of data is moved lots of places, we might be short-sighted in thinking of delete as something special, because there are resources that are created but not yet provisioned, or active but not active, or existing but have invoked the right to be forgotten. And there may be a more general case here for resources that can be used for different types of purposes or different levels, rather than going from a two-state model, exist and not exist, to just a three-state model, exist, soft deleted, and not exist. There might be need for something richer.
Yeah, I already agreed with Tony.
So this is Barry. It seems we're not here right now to hash this out. We're here to see if people are interested in working on this. It sounds like the answer is yes, there is an interest in it. So let's put that on the list of
Right.
what to talk about.
Okay, that was it.
Okay. No other questions. So I think next up is probably Björn. Password.
Hi, Bjorn Onestad. And there is actually a box here.
Yes.
I thought it was a...
That's what we're saying, standing.
It's not just a virtual box, there's a literal box. Okay. All right. Okay, go back one slide. Oh, we're here to talk about passwords. Okay, Scim passwords. So the first question, when the idea of adding some password or credential management to Scim came up, my first reaction was, wait a minute, aren't we like 20 years too late to be thinking about standardizing this? Because aren't we done with passwords, and can't we just forget that and move on to something else? But the fact of the matter is that passwords, even in a multi-factor and highly secure and tokenized world, they still have a role to play. And what we're finding is that a lot of companies are trying to use Scim in ways where, rather than just purely provisioning and throwing the resource or the user across the wall or throwing them up to the cloud, there's actually the identity management aspect of it. So in the system for cross-domain identity management, there's the identity management, which involves, in some cases, credential management. At least that's the topic for today. Okay, next, thanks. Okay, so even though the Scim charter and the Scim scope so far has been primarily focused on provisioning use cases, we're thinking about, and we're asking whether there's interest in moving more and emphasizing more of the identity management. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The use cases often involve managing users within the service provider, not just creating them and provisioning them and then having them go their separate ways as two different entities, but actually allowing things like a client application to change, let a user change refine, reset, recover their account with that service provider, where it's not necessarily the same party being the service provider and the identity management client. They may be separate. Okay? There are also a number of use cases like ours, the one that Unbound ID does, where Scim's being used as interfaces for administrative tools and so on within a domain, where you've got large-scale end-user self-service, right? Where the user themselves, the customer, is supposed to be maintaining their own account, and you don't have an enterprise or a workflow or a manager or an IT department that's doing it for them. So self-service from wherever the customer or the user is touching your system all the way back to their identity record and their Scim record, okay? We're also thinking about using Scim for general purpose, and I use the word directories here, of people and things, right? We hear about identity of things. We have about the coming era of identity at the center and the hub of everything. And we'd like to have Scim as that protocol, and we're relying on it in our designs for doing that. So when you think about how do I provision things, how do I create credentials that allow things to access my data, passwords come into that. So anyway, handling credentials and passwords we believe is relevant. I know Oracle has similar use cases, and there may be other companies that are also interested in standardizing on that. We've actually done some work here. We have some designs. We're going down one particular architectural route for the schemas and the protocol for this, and Oracle's going a different way. So if this is of interest, then we'll try to bring those together, take the smartest from both of those, as you know, the phrase Phil used earlier, so I'll just quote him on that. That's the intention, is to take the best parts of both approaches and let the community decide what we should bring into the standard. Yeah, I guess there is a consideration slide here. There are a number of things to think about before we decide voluntarily to take on this effort as a standards body. The multiple approaches we talked about, but there are also things to deal with, like representations of account state, and I alluded to that in my comment earlier to Marquez's presentation. And then you've got some very basic mundane things, like what is the exchange between the client application and the service provider in terms of saying, yes, that password or credential is strong enough, right? We've got the classic, well, you've got to have 8 characters, 3 of them must, you know, meet this regex. But you may also have things like the signal to noise ratio on a voice print, or the clarity of a thumbprint scan, or something like that, that could eventually become part of a protocol for a credential policy. And then the big one is really, how do you recover an account? And that's the most challenging use case here, because at that point you've got an anonymous user who wants to regain control of something using a credential they no longer have. And if we can solve for that, then I think the other things will pretty much fall into line. Okay, and that involves things like closing that major backdoor, where, you know, using the account recovery mechanism is one of the most common ways for hijacking an account when you don't know its original password. Okay. All right, that's it.
Questions? Comments? Okay. I think we had one more, right? And that's Tony. Oh, you're not presenting, you're asking questions.
Asking questions, Tony Nadlin. I think you seem to be concentrated on passwords a little bit, maybe too much. But if it was more focused on credentials, we could allow, there's other things coming along the pike that, you know, as we try to get rid of passwords. And if we could make this a more generic credential thing, it might be something that we would definitely be interested in as we move forward.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tony. In fact, my comment to my engineering team was, let's not think about this in terms of passwords. Let's call it credentials.
Okay.
Right? Passwords have some specific attributes that make them a subclass of credential. And then, of course, other subclasses of credential will have their own. But I definitely agree with you.
Because there is some work going on in the W3C to do with credentials also, so we would probably want to tie some of that work together.
Thank you, Tony. I'm going to make some comments, and none of them should be taken as any form of agreement with Tony. John Bradley. Yeah, looking at it from the point of view of credentials, there are some things that, having looked at how Scim works with federated protocols, specifically OpenID Connect, in a lot of cases, we see the identity provider or authentication provider is not the tenant, which creates an interesting conceptual problem with Scim because everything is looked at from the point of view of the tenant. So what is that federated authentication assertion that the SaaS is supposed to expect that's going to be tied to that account? There isn't an obvious way of doing that at the moment. There is, password, but that's just nasty. So how do you map an authentication provider, credential provider, into that tenant account? We're also looking at, logging in is one thing. There's also the whole problem of how do you do session management? How do you signal that for a given device, because these SaaSes have some people coming in via the webs, they have some people coming in through native apps, etc. How does the enterprise through its or the authentication provider signal, oh, this user's iPhone is gone, so we want all of the tokens blown away on that particular device, or all of their sessions terminated, etc. And so far I haven't found any plausible way of actually mapping that through Scim, which leads us to saying, we've got to do session management outside of Scim, which sort of takes away from the momentum of people wanting to deploy Scim. So if people are going to want to do session management to kill off these things sort of independent of the provisioning aspects of Scim. If they get both for deploying one protocol, they're more likely to do it. SaaS providers are incredibly lazy. And so unless we come up with some highly motivating factors, I talked to one of the larger ones who recently looked at Scim and said, that's nasty. We're not going to do that. They're probably the largest SaaS provider. I don't know. Probably up there with Microsoft. But somebody who, they're on the fence about Scim. Is it really worth the pain, or could they come up with something simpler that covers 80% of what they need to do? So if we could come up with some way that the notions of the authentication provider is not necessarily the tenant, it needs to be delegated by the tenant, and some way of mapping those sessions so that we don't have to have a completely separate, SLO. Again, sessions are we've traditionally thought of them as being web things, but I think at some point we're going to have to come to, in the very near future, we're going to have to come to grips that all of the things that are coming off of a device for a particular APIs to a particular website are going to need to be terminated in the same way that we want to do single logout from web sessions. So there's a bunch of things that need to be done. The question is, can they actually fit in the Scim model? And again, none of that is anything could be taken to agree with Tony.
Well, I think it's certainly a valid point that more things covered by one protocol might make it more attractive, but they may also make it more complicated. So we drew the line at authentication is not Scim, but keeping track of the credential data is part of the resource definition, and that comes under what we would want to do in a Scim extension or something like it.
Phil here, I just want to echo John's comments. I think we have interest too in potentially doing things like enabling interfaces so that in addition to user self-service for password, you could revoke OAuth authorizations, look at the clients that you have and other things. It really comes down to, in some of these cases, is sorting out where's the interop requirement. We can all build our own UI and our own components to do things like token revocation and things like that. But I think when you look at it from an identity management perspective, we're definitely getting a lot of requests from enterprise organizations that say, I want to be able to connect a management system in my enterprise, which is paying up with your Oracle Cloud, and I expect those to be able to work. And this is where we come back to saying, well, okay, then we need a standard. I don't think that
So
there's a...
it sort of sounds that what everybody is saying here is that there is, perhaps little interest in passwords per se, but significant interest in various forms of authentication credentials, right? And it may not be just about, user authentication. It could be, device or session authentication. Maybe we should leave it at that and just sort of...
I'll just sum this up. I think that we might have to do some wordsmithing on the charter, because I think John also brought up the other aspect of how to map, which might have been missing because we didn't do the SAML thing. How do I map a SAML credential in? Is there a key that looks up other than username or some other thing that becomes the mapping? Some people are using the external ID, which has got pros and cons, and so yeah, I'm shaking my head too. So I'm not sure what the charter would be, but we should look at the whole domain of credential handling.
But I want to leave us some room to talk about working group next step, and we have got 20 minutes left. So.
Right. This is quick. So yeah, I generally agree. I think the missing piece is really around authentication policy, and that's the part that's not handled by federation standards, and it's not handled by the provisioning sort of core Scim that we're doing. It's the sort of the missing in between, and everybody's doing their own sort of solution for it. And certainly as an extension of Scim, it would be a nice idea to sort of, add semantics to deal with that policy configuration and management. How to handle sessions, how to handle federations, and if you do local credentials, how do you deal with that credentials, whether it's password or anything else.
All right, thank you very much.
So, yeah. So Björn can. So we have one more, and I want to leave us at least like 15 minutes. So let's keep it.
Well, this is the easy one.
Yeah. Good.
Okay, so there's not a lot of meat here, but it really is a concept. And the concept is, if we're already modeling resources that are provisioned, resources that have an identity, potentially resources that have a life cycle, can be deleted, have credentials, etc., perhaps there's reason to add to the core schema the concept of a device, a non-human, right? Just like we have users, and then we have groups of users, and we have a subclass extension of users called an enterprise user. Perhaps we need to add something for devices so that all those people out there who are building provisioning systems for Fitbit devices, for automobiles, for airplanes, for power plants, etc., for medical devices, might look at Scim as a nice protocol for that. And in fact, before Scim was even came up, I had a case for that, working with a large fleet company where we had to provision trucks, trailers, GPS devices, drivers who were not users, and locations as well. So I think there is definitely an industry need for this. Okay, so the idea would be to add to this model, this is the current model, go on, and add another class of core resource here called a device with some set of attributes to be determined. And then out of that, there could be extensions for particular industries, for particular use cases. Okay, next. So Mortez has put a little list together here with some input from me, where a device would have, of course, its own ID. It would have a name. There would be a /devices endpoint, just like there is for /users/groups today. Schema there, and then extensions in particular for that device. Next. Okay. So the only required ones are at the top there, the ID, a device name, the meta attribute, of course. What you find in this realm is that devices have a lot of identifiers, and it varies by industry, right? Many of them have MAC addresses, serial numbers, unit numbers, license numbers, registration numbers, IP addresses, serial numbers. Maybe I mentioned that one already. So there are a lot of those. There's also a rich world of owners, right? Who owns the device? Whose data is being collected by the device? Who's using the device right now? Various properties like that, which we would probably want to leave out of the schema, so we're not trying to incorporate all of that. We also need to consider the type of device and what its capabilities are. You know, is it able to do two-way communication? Is it just streaming data? Does it have this, that, or the other capability? Maybe even potentially, does it have the ability to capture an authentication credential? That might be one capability, right? If it's a scanner or an eyeball reader or something like that. And then the other one that I would argue might be an important type of attribute to generalize is location. Because even though not all devices can keep track of a GPS location, they are physically, they are located in physical space somewhere, whether statically or dynamically, so there might be a use for a location attribute as part of the standard schema. And I think that's it. Well, communication devices being one specific example. Telephones, cell phones, video conferencing systems, two-way elevator emergency buttons, whatever they might be. Okay, that's one example. I think we'll leave the details of the example. And then the same discussion as we've had on the other 3 points. Is this something there's general interest in working on? Thank you.
Actually, this one specifically, anybody interested in this? I mean, everybody's implementing something like this. The question is there value in standardizing the core device model and then potentially some of the extensions? I'm sort of sitting on the fence. I mean, we've implemented a whole bunch of these, but when I look at it, I'm not sure if there's value in interoperability for that level or not. It's really a question.
Yeah, Håvard. I don't think we're exactly really interested in this, but I think we would be interested in using the devices for authentication. So tying it into, this is this user's cell phone, you can use it as a two-factor authentication mechanism and things like that. I think that's the biggest use case that I can see in our industry.
So let me just ask the question. So you're interested in the core device notion, but not necessarily all the derivative sort of, owners or sort of capabilities. There's like standardizing any of those things.
Well, some of that needs to go in to do the authentication, right? So
okay.
So I'm interested in representing a device as part of an authentication scheme.
Right. So maybe that ties back into what John brought up with sort of the authentication policy in general. We need that for Scim, and then we might need a new endpoint for specific non-users. Good, thanks. Kelly?
Hey, this is Kelly. To me, it's kind of outside of the realm of the identity management a little bit. I don't know that I guess I don't have a big problem with modeling it. I think Scim is good with that. Pulling it into the core schema may be a stretch for me, though.
I actually disagree with you that this is outside the realm of identity management. We see that all the time. Device ID is just as important as user ID for us, at least. I certainly can speak for the collaboration side of it, and I see that in IoT all over the place. But not only that, we actually sort of have a very desperate need for app ID as well, which is a separate conversation. But I actually see that as an identity. The question is how much value there is in standardizing some of this stuff, because if you really sort of boil it down to the core essence of it, it comes down to a very, very small set.
Right.
And it's like, how much value do you get with that? Because a lot of it becomes specific to that device, to that vendor, to that solution type of thing.
You'd have a really thin.
That's what I'm
thin
struggling
core
with
schema
myself.
with
Right.
extensions,
It becomes very, very thin.
Yeah.
But there might be value in it, especially if you sort of come up with a policy around it, sorry.
So I actually don't want us to keep sort of drilling at this particular point, because we have 10 minutes left, and I want to have the conversation about next step. So just as a lead into that conversation is, you may notice that we only requested 1 hour here, and the reason for that is because we in Hawaii said, if there are no extension proposals by Dallas, we're not going to schedule a meeting. And then we actually have some extension proposals. They do exist. But they were actually quite late in the process, right? And that sort of begs the question of how much is there enough energy to go directly from our core documents and forge ahead with a lot of extension work? And is that the amount of work that we see before us? Does that warrant keeping the working group alive at this point, right? So just to put some sort of framework around this, I think Barry will bear me out that whatever we decide to do, whether we decide that we want to keep going, the work that needs to be done here requires a recharter, right? And what Barry has told both me and Morteza is that he would support creating a spin-off working group for Scim extensions without the BOF cycle. And at that point, there is actually very little difference between the recharter process and spinning up a new working group. That's basically the same thing, right? So I think what we should talk about now is, is there energy to work on these things? Is there interest? Is there interest to do it now? Would meeting in Prague and Yokohama actually be a realistic option for the working group? Will people come to Prague and work on this? Will people come to Yokohama and work on this? Or do we need more time? And the floor is open.
Tony Nedlin, for the majority of what was proposed, I would be in favor of working on them. I'm not anxious to work on the notifications at all, but I'm not against the notifications, as I believe that steps into territory that is just nasty as far as that's concerned. I can understand why some people need it, but I'm not sure it totally belongs in Scim, but I'm not going to be, an opponent, be against the effort if people want to work on it. But the other ones I think are very valuable to move Scim into a more of an operational environment than what it is today, because these are things that are definitely needed and so we'd be willing to work on it.
To set the stage, this is Barry. What I had suggested to Leif was that if there's interest and energy to work on this stuff now and just keep going and get it out, that's fine. But perhaps one thing that would work would be to let people go off for a while and play with this in an operational environment and work with each other sort of outside of the working group and figure out which ones would really get used and how you wanted to do them. Like, for instance, for the soft delete, which way you wanted to go, whether it was different attributes, isn't those states, right? Different states, or whether you wanted to do a soft delete or whatever. Go off and figure that out and play with it and do some testing and then come back with a proposal. And if that would be the better way to do that, then we might close this working group and create an extensions working group when y'all were ready to come back and do the documents. Or if you're ready to do them now, do them now. So that was the trade-off.
Phil here. Just thinking about the passwords, I know Mortez has indicated they've actually implemented code and Oracle has implemented code that we're shipping. I think others have said so too. We do, I have a draft I can publish as one possibility, one model and everything. I had my eyes open today in the discussion today that Scim is going to, although we don't have an authentication system, we depend on authentication. Scim is also the data store for credentials, and there's a larger context to the whole password issue. And I think we need to get going, because we do have a model going, but I think it's going to take us a while to sort out what is that larger security value that Scim is providing to the network in terms of the data it's providing. I have had simple questions about, does it make sense to use HTTP to authenticate with an authorization header, while at the same time Scim is actually the database for the authentication system. So there's this kind of feedback concern corporate architects have had about Scim playing both an application and an authentication system.
I think the question is, Phil, are you ready? Let's say Barry says, no, you guys need to produce real results by Prague, right? Are you guys ready to? Well, no. I mean, I'm playing with. I'm putting it on. I mean, yes, I'm being a little bit on the nose here, but are we gonna be like in just waiting around until the next time we can meet in North America? Because then there's really no point in having the working group open, right? Then it's going to be until 2017 until we can meet physically again, right? Or no, it doesn't matter, right? We'll keep these documents coming out, and we're going to clear them up on the mailing list. We don't have to meet physically, right? I mean, what are we talking about in terms of planning, right? Is it
Well, I don't know.
now,
If
or is
are we
it-
looking for a model for all of this, and somebody to just say, well, this is what we're doing, we want you to do it this way?
I'm
or do we
talking
wanna
actually about
discuss it?
milestones, right? If you come and say, yes, I have this notified draft, I
Yeah.
want to talk about it, right? Some people say, yes, it's useful, some say I'm not opposed to doing
Yeah.
it. It seems that there's interest, we could get it done. If I'm asking you about milestone for a recharter, would you say within the next year, within the next 2 years, or within the next 6 months? I mean, where are we? That's the kind of discussion I think we should have.
Well, I think, my personal impression, I think Notify is well along, and we could start working on that in detail, and it's fairly well scoped. Password, credential management, we kind of opened the door. If anything, we didn't scope it down. So that's my hesitation. I'm not sure what to say, because everybody said, well, I want to talk about devices and everything else, and that seems like a good thing. So I'm just kind of like, well, okay, if we're going to do this, let's get going on it, and I'm concerned about an implied delay, that's all.
Right, I mean, we can also talk about sort of staging, and I mean, we could test, right? We could say, okay, so Notify and Soft Delete seem to be fairly well along, right? So let's ask Barry to put those on the charter right now and see if we can complete them, right? If we don't complete them within a reasonable amount of time, say by significant progress by Prague, then we're really pulling the plug, right? Yeah, that's an option too, I guess.
So independent of the charter discussion, I'm, as an individual, interested in working on these things. I actually think that we should continue working on them fast and not wait for sort of some arbitrary time. That's something that everybody's implementing. If you don't actually come up with solutions, you end up with 5 implementations or 10 implementations, and bring them together is going to be much more difficult. So I'd rather get them going, but that could totally go in as individual contribution with a bunch of us working together, and then bringing them to IETF as individual contribution, or sort of,
Right, I mean,
recharter or a new working group.
That's a possibility. We could just
Right.
churn out the two or three things that seem to be like well developed, right? And then by Prague, we'll know whether this is, okay, a recharter, an actual recharter, or a respin, or a let's just see what happens.
All right. Tony Nedlin, I'd like to see us continue on at least the password or credential. As I said,
Yeah, notify whatever. Right?
yeah, I don't care
As far
about,
as you're concerned, notify whatever.
right, but I don't believe that we should spin down at this point. I think we've got the momentum. I think if we spin down, it's going to be, we're going to lose people and lose interest, and I don't think that it's.
You're concerned about the messaging
Yeah.
around the Scim effort, right? So that's okay.
And this
That's fair
keeps the
enough.
messaging going
Yeah,
forward
yeah,
that this is still being worked on.
Barry, that all sounds good. I like the approach that Rafe just said. No changes to the charter, no changes to anything else. You guys start putting out some proposed documents and discussing them, and in a few months, we see what progress you've made and decide whether to recharter or not. That sounds like a good plan.
Ms. Kelly, I would say, from my perspective, it seems like the credential management has the most desire behind it, or the broad desire behind it. So if we're going to prioritize, I would definitely help out and say that if we're going to do them serially instead of parallel, that's something that we should attack first.
I mean, the resource issues there are two, right? There's like producing stuff and getting stuff reviewed. And I think there's like infinite resources to get stuff produced, because you guys are all pursuing your individual like priorities. That's cool, right?
Sure.
But the problem is getting the group as a whole to review all of this stuff. And there I think we're going to have to prioritize, right?
Right. I mean, it as far as setting milestones and things, right? If we let's say for 6 months out for credential management, a year out for soft delete, and 18 months for notify, or something like that.
Yeah, right.
You know, so we can have
Right.
more concerted efforts.
Right. But I think that I think we have consensus here to everybody churn out your individual submissions, and whether we meet physically in Prague or not doesn't matter, I think. But we're talking about the Prague time scale, that kind of in the next 3 to 4 months, we're going to make a decision on whether this stuff needs more time to develop, or if we're just rechartering, or maybe there's so much energy that we just change the name of the working group basically to Scim X, and keep doing extensions for a while. That can be decided at a later time, right? Okay, does that feel okay for the working group? You can hum or say yes or raise your hands, or feels okay? Okay. I mean, I guess the sense here that there's so few. For those of you who are listening in on the wireless, this is clear consensus. There are a few people in the room, but they're all nodding their heads and
Well,
supporting.
I'm
the plan.
concerned this has been a no-op, because we made presentations in Hawaii, we've made another round of presentations and submitted drafts, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do between now and Prague, now that I've got a draft submitted. I want to get that on the table.
Well, I think what you need now is review and reactions to that draft, like any working group, right? So if people think
Right,
this is
so it's
important,
been published for a month
Right.
now, so we either kill it, or
no, I think this is like
that's what we're here for.
Right, first of all, there is an important message in the room right now. There is interest. There is expressed interest.
That's what I'm saying. My thought was we were coming here today to decide on the case of notify whether it would become a working draft or not. And if we're going to push
Well,
it off,
well-
it's just been a bit of a
I
no-op.
mean, we can't do that because it's not on our charter. Right?
So, well, we can't, right, you can't produce the document, but you can certainly discuss it. And you could discuss it here, you could discuss it on the email list. What I would like to see is, it's not pushing it off, what I'd like to see is a demonstration that people are willing to review these documents and discuss them on the mailing list
Right.
and move them forward. And so that's, everybody who's here or is listening is charged with doing that. Phil has a document or two, whatever. Other people, if you don't have documents, make them, and let's see if we can get some discussion of the documents. And if we do, then that gives us an answer.
Right.
So I guess what, Tony, Madeline, I guess what Phil's trying to get at is if there's activity on the mailing list and people are interested, is there a way to get the charter updated before Prague so that we can actually
Absolutely.
accept these and get them worked on? I think that's Phil's
Absolutely.
concern and my
Okay.
concern too.
Absolutely.
When we're saying by 3 or 4 months, we're saying that that's by then,
Right.
right? If the decision is clear in 6 weeks, we'll recharter in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
You know, that's fine.
So I mean, formally, I think it's up to our area director to decide whether we can change our charter or not, right? And I'm guessing, what I'm hearing Barry saying here is that he's going to make a judgment call based on the activity on the list with respect to these documents, right? And Barry is nodding his head in support of what I said, so. Okay, I think that's it, unless anybody has anything else. Yep, thank you.
Free beer.
I mean, we'll see if there's...